Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton School of Public International Affairs. I am Amani Jamal. I am the dean of the school, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. One of Princeton SPIA's strategic priorities is internationalization. Our researchers and faculty experts are doing outstanding work on global issues, and speakers from across the world visit us routinely to offer important analyses and context. Our guest today is uniquely qualified to enlighten us on developments in China, as well as the Middle East and Ukraine, the Ukraine-Russia war, and the future of U.S. foreign policy in light of this week's election. Edward Wong is a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. In 25 years at the Times, he has reported from scores of countries and served as a war correspondent in Iraq and as the Beijing bureau chief as well. His reporting has focused on the multipolar world, authoritarian states, and superpower rivalries involving the United States. Edward is the winner of the Livingston Award for International Reporting and was on a team of Pulitzer Prize finalists. Earlier this year, he published At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, to widespread acclaim. This is not simply a welcome for Edward, but also a welcome back. He previously served as a visiting professor at Princeton, in addition to teaching at Harvard and UC Berkeley. It's a great, great honor to have him with us this evening. My thanks to Edward for joining us today, and to all of you for turning out for today's thought-provoking discussion with our very own Professor Rory Truex. Rory is a professor of politics and public policy, expert on China, and is a great friend and colleague. So I will turn this over to Rory, and Ed, we look forward to the conversation. Over to you, Rory. Okay.
Hi, mic's on. So thank you, Dean Jamal, for that extraordinarily generous welcome. As the dean pointed out, this is a homecoming for me. I love being in Princeton. I lived here for a year from 2016 to 2017 when my wife was an MPP student mid-career, getting mid-career master's here at SPIA. And I taught in the spring semester at the Humanities Council. So Princeton's a second home to me. There's a bit of deja vu this week because I remember that the first Trump election took place in November 2016 when I was living here. And in fact, Tania and I watched it with a group of her MPP classmates in an apartment in downtown Princeton. And obviously there was a lot of grappling with the aftermath of that in the days ahead. So I think we're kind of feeling we're in the same place once again. Anyways, I think what we'll do is this will be a wide-ranging talk today. I'm very eager to, engage with your questions and find out what interests you. And I think what we'll do is I'll run through a slideshow that summarizes one of the main storylines in my book on China. It's a very personal storyline, but I think it speaks to the bigger themes of authoritarianism, of the Chinese Communist Party, and of their both domestic and international ambitions. And then Rory and I will talk about some of those themes, and we'll also talk about U.S. foreign policy. And I think that on your minds, I'm sure you're wondering what where the U.S. might go in the coming months and years as Biden leaves the stage and as we enter a second Trump administration, and then specifically also where U.S. China relations go from there. So I will start off by talking about my book. And the storyline we talk about is that of my father and his time in China in the People's Liberation Army working under Mao. And I wrote this book because I wanted to help readers who were interested in China, but perhaps weren't well versed in Chinese history, find an entry point into China, both of the recent past in the Mao era and then in contemporary China today. So the book has two main storylines. One is that of my father, and the other is that of myself as I went to China mainly in 2008, stayed there for nearly a decade, reported in the New York Times. But I found that a lot of the issues and the themes I was reporting on were echoes of what had taken place in my father's time, specifically China's vision of itself as this modern day power that was trying to hold on to what had been the Qing Empire before. And my father was part of the military project that was engaged in reconstructing this empire. So the book very explicitly talks about that in its title, At the Edge of Empire. And one other thing I think that might resonate currently with some of you is that I felt that I wanted to capture something about that history of mid-20th century China, as well as the history of other nations, and it helped explain to readers why these authoritarian movements with charismatic leaders were able to seize the imaginations of their citizens, especially of the youth in these countries, and how those young citizens came to work for the cause of these leaders, and then in some cases eventually became disillusioned with them, as my father did. So this is where I grew up, in Alexandria, Virginia. I was born in Washington, and then my parents moved to Alexandria, a suburb, within that year. This is us at Mount Vernon, so it's a very American photo. I'm there with my sister, who's 2 years younger. And my father, Yukern in Cantonese, Edward Wong, worked in restaurants most of his life. He's still alive. He's 92 right now, still in my childhood home. But for his entire career in the U.S., he worked in restaurants. One of these many nameless Chinese waiters or managers who might have helped you out in taking your order. And this is the only uniform that I knew him by when I was growing up, this uniform that he put on every day to go to work. But in my 20s, as I got more interested in China and started studying Chinese history and politics at Berkeley, I began interviewing my parents, both my father and mother, about their past in the People's Republic as well as in Hong Kong. And my father placed this photo in my hand one night in our house, and it's a photo of him in a PLA uniform that was taken in 1953. You look at this photo and you see that there's a smudge or a dark shadow on his cap, and there used to be a red star there, which is a symbol of the PLA. And when he mailed this photo from communist China to his father, who was living in the British colony of Hong Kong, his father rubbed out the red star because his father feared that if the British authorities found this photo of his son in a PLA uniform, then the family would get in trouble there in this British colony. My father was born in Hong Kong. He was born into the family of an herbal medicine importer and exporter. His father was a businessman who ran an herbal medicine shop in Hong Kong, and he was part of this class of transnational Cantonese from southern China who could move easily between southern China, the British colony, as well as Southeast Asia. His father would import herbal medicine from mainland China and then sell it both in Hong Kong as well as to Chinese business people in Southeast Asia. And there you see my father's older brother, Sam, older by 4 years. And they spent their entire childhood together. They lived in a place called Happy Valley in Hong Kong, where there was a horse racetrack, and then went to school in Causeway Bay. But their childhood was interrupted by the Japanese invasion, which of course caused huge suffering across China, including across China as well as other parts of Asia. And the Japanese invaded Hong Kong shortly after they attacked Pearl Harbor and occupied it at the end of 1941. Early 1942, my father and Sam and several other family members decide they should move to southern China, back to their ancestral village, because it might be safer there. The Japanese had tight control of Hong Kong, but in southern China, it was a more fluid situation. Sometimes the nationalist government or the KMT would control areas of the South, and sometimes the Japanese would control areas, but it moved very quickly, and circumstances would change. So they felt that there was a greater margin for safety in the South. And so they moved to Guangdong province. My father then went to high school in Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong. Here he is with some classmates as well as cousins. They would go swimming on weekends. And at that time, Japan surrendered. They surrendered in 1945. Then in the coming years, the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists would reignite. They have formed a pact to fight the Japanese together, but that broke down soon after Japanese surrender. And much of the fighting raged in northern China. The bloodiest battles were in the north at the time. My father heard about the communist campaign. And of course, there were communist sympathizers in the South, even though the communists did not control huge parts of southern China. And my father, for example, thinks that one of the teachers in his high school, which was a prestigious boarding school, was a communist sympathizer. He heard about the ideas of communism and he embraced them. He thought that if the communists and Mao could triumph, then they could rebuild China from the low level that it had reached because of the Japanese War, because of what he saw as the misgovernance of the nationalists. There was rampant inflation in China at the time. And my father remembers very clearly the way that prices of household goods would fluctuate even within a day. And he saw what he considered to be, criminal elements out in the streets in Guangzhou, including gambling dens and brothels. And he also thought that the nationalists had a very difficult time fighting the Japanese. And so the nationalists were not able to protect China properly or govern it properly. And so the communists triumphed in 1949. They established the People's Republic. My father graduates from high school in the spring of 1950, is in the first graduating class to enter China fully ruled by the communists. And at that time, around that time, his brother, who has graduated several years before, decides to take a scholarship to go to America to study engineering. His brother Sam ends up in Washington, D.C., studying at George Washington University. My father makes the opposite decision. He gets into Beijing Agricultural University and decides he wants to go north to Beijing because the heart of the revolution is there. Mao has moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, and my father wants to be part of the Communist project. And so he moves up there and he makes a long journey from the south by rail up to Beijing. Many of you are familiar with this landscape of China. And on the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, he marches in front of Mao and the communist leaders in Tiananmen Square. And he drops out a few weeks later to join the military. And the reason why he joins the military is because at this time, Mao is exhorting young Chinese men to help fight for the defense of China by going to the Korean Peninsula and fighting the American forces on the Korean Peninsula. Because Mao is telling people that if the Americans triumph in the Korean War and defeat the North Koreans on the peninsula, they'll march onward to China and try and topple Mao and the communists and put the nationalists who are in Taiwan back in power. So my father joins the military. He's sent up to Harbin to train in an Air Force academy. That's in the far northeast there, near the border with back then the Soviet Union and North Korea. And a few weeks after he starts training, he gets this message from the teachers in the academy telling him he has to leave the academy and join an army unit instead that will head back towards interior China and then to the far west. It's unclear to him at this moment why he's being told to join that unit, and the reason becomes clear a few years later. But he suspects something is wrong, though he decides to obey the order. He then goes back to Beijing and he takes a series of army trucks that lead him out to the far northwest of China to a region called Xinjiang. He is put into army units out in Xinjiang. This is the other existing photo of him in the PLA uniform. And again, it's from the same year, 1953, when he's stationed in Xinjiang. And he's put into units out there where he has to work with Kazakh soldiers, Uyghur soldiers, Kazakh herders as well, to try and indoctrinate them into communist ideology and both merge the soldiers into the PLA. At that time, they were more of a member of militia units that fought against the nationalists, but the communists are intent on merging them into the PLA, and then teaching them and Kazakh herders in the area about Mao's vision and about the coming industrialization of China. So this is a type of area that he was working in. This is in Altai, on the one of the most remote parts of China, on the border of today Mongolia, Russia, and Kazakhstan. And here, the predominant group are Kazakh Muslims. He was told to work among them. And later on, I made a journey to Altai myself to try and find out exactly what his army unit was doing. This photo is from a photographer who went with me up there to Altai that year. And he served several years out in Xinjiang, and eventually his last posting is again in another Kazakh area called Wenchuan, which is near Soviet Kazakhstan. And there he's placed in one of the very first agricultural garrisons that the military sets up. There's a system of garrisons that the military sets up between 1952 and 1954 and then formalizes around 1954 that essentially is told to produce meat and crops to help feed the soldiers who have been sent out to Xinjiang. And this system, called the Bingtuan, eventually becomes this vast system of control that the party and the military uses, partly as almost a settler colonial project in some ways, to get Han soldiers to move out to Xinjiang, and then eventually to encourage Han civilians also to move out to Xinjiang. And I visited some of these garrisons when I was out there, including one in Wenchuan that my father served in. And many of them have become large cities now that are mostly ethnic Han, different than the other ethnicities of Xinjiang, but they're obviously these almost colonial projects populated by Han, and they're very much engaged in global commerce now. A lot of these areas have factories that produce goods that end up on the grocery store shelves in America or in Europe, and that's part of the debate, I think, right now in U.S. China policy is imposing export controls on goods from places like this. So my father serves out his last year here in Wenchuan. Then he hears a call from the party to have talented men go back to interior China in order to finish their educations and help build up an industrial China. Around the same time, 1956, military officials right above him tell him that he's done a good job working for the military out there in Xinjiang, and that they will recommend him for party membership. And in my father's head, this is kind of almost a realization of a dream. He had wanted to be a party member for much of his time in the PRC. And he also felt that his vision of serving the PRC in Korea had been sidetracked. During his time in Xinjiang, he found out that it had been sidetracked because the party and the military had questions about his family background, the fact that he was from Hong Kong, from a capitalist family in Hong Kong, and that his brother had gone to live and work in the US. But now he felt he had overcome that with this recommendation by senior officials. And so he enrolls in university back in the interior of China in a place called Xi'an, and enrolls in an aeronautics program. And his goal is to learn how to be an aeronautics engineer in order to build military aircraft for the PLA as a civilian now that he's out of the army. But in the late 50s, several large events come to a head in China. On a personal level, my father is told by officials at the university that they're going to hold off on admitting him to the party. And they tell him it's because he still has questionable elements in his family background, and they plan on investigating him and his family background further. And so this instantly creates anxiety in my father. He realizes that despite everything he's done, he can't escape the shadow of this idea of him as a potential subversive. Um, and then right around that time, 1957, this meeting of party elders and leaders takes place called the Lushan Conference. Mao decides to purge Peng Dehuai, a senior military commander, at that conference. And Peng, my father and many other soldiers viewed Peng as a hero because Peng had helped lead the Red Army to victory in the Chinese Civil War, and they were puzzled and astounded that he was being purged by Mao. And Peng had started raising some questions about Mao's decisions and policies, and including Mao's economic policies. And then, of course, soon after that, China enters the heart of the Great Famine that takes place because of Mao's economic policies. And over the course of 3 to 4 years, an estimated 30 to 40 million Chinese die because of the famine. My father was on the campus in Xi'an when this took place, and he survived the famine along with his classmates, but he was emaciated, as you can tell from this photo, and there were times when he was bedridden and could barely walk. And so all these events, compel my father to decide that there's no future for him in China, and that the future of the nation itself is in question, and that he has to make an escape back to his home city of Hong Kong, the British colony. And so he constructs a complicated scheme when he returns on vacation to Guangzhou, in the far south, where he has family ties, and he gets a police officer to give him a travel document, this travel permit that you see up here, that allows him to leave Guangzhou for a visit to Macau, the Portuguese colony that's next to Guangdong. And so he goes to Macau in late 1962. His brother Sam is in Okinawa at that time, helping do engineering work on a U.S. missile system in Okinawa, because Sam is now working for the U.S. military as an engineer. Sam meets with him in a hotel room in Macau, and they put together the final phase of his plan to leave for Hong Kong. And my father does get permission to leave for Hong Kong in 1963 from Hong Kong authorities who are based in Macau. He returns to Hong Kong, spends several years there, leaves for Washington, D.C. In 1967, bringing his grandmother there to join Sam and other family members. Here, they're in a restaurant in Jade Palace in D.C., celebrating her 90th birthday. My father works his first restaurant job there, and eventually he and my mother raise me and my sister in the suburbs. And then my father goes back to the PRC 3 times in his adult life to visit it. Once is on a short tour in 1999. And then the other times are when I'm working in China from 2008 to 2016 for the New York Times. He comes once in 2009 for my wedding, once in 2012 for the birth of my daughter, Aria. And during those periods, we have long conversations about where China has come, but also where it's going, because in 2012, he arrives the same month that Xi Jinping is taking power in the 18th Party Congress. And in fact, we make a trip down to Guangdong province for him to see old classmates of his, right at the same time that Xi himself is making his first trip out of Beijing after taking power. And Xi makes this trip to Guangdong, where he gets on board a naval destroyer in the South China Sea, kind of signaling the expansive foreign policy that he'll undertake there in the South China Sea and other places around China. He also gives a secret speech to party members at that time, talking about the fall of the Soviet Union and how, because Soviet leaders had let up on party control of the Soviet Union, then they allowed the Soviet Union to fall apart, and that Xi himself and others would not allow this to happen in China. In my research for the book, I found that Xi had said very similar things to Vice President Biden when the two had a dinner in Southwest China in 2011 during Biden's first series of trips to China to meet with Xi. A person who was in that dinner, an American official, told me that Xi had very explicitly brought up the downfall of the Soviet Union. And I think that in many ways dovetails with this theme of reconstituting empire that this project that my father was part of, because she sees the modern day party as an extension of the Qing Empire and as this entity that has to hold together this modern day empire, maybe even expand it in places like the South China Sea, possibly Taiwan, and that he has to take this hardline authoritarian direction in his rule in order to keep this construction together. So that's, in summary, some of the narrative lines and main themes of my book. And I'll be very happy to speak with Rory about, to go more in depth on this and to speak with all of you. Thank you. Oh, and one other thing I should mention is there's signed copies of the book at Labyrinth Books, and I went there and signed copies earlier. And if you have a student ID, apparently you get a 15% discount there. So, right.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ed, for sharing the book. And I would just say, as a student of China, I really, really recommend the book. In large part because often when we teach Chinese history or read about Chinese history, it's always told through the main characters, Mao, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping. And this is a nice way to read Chinese history, but through the lens of a family, and you understand just how tumultuous Chinese history was and how individual lives and families were broken apart and shifted because of all the different political events, especially in the Mao era. So it's really a wonderful read. And it's nice to see, Ed, you don't often get to write in narrative form like this.
Yeah.
And so it's a treat to see you read like that, write like that. So I would endorse the book. And I think there are only 5 signed copies.
Right.
Correct? So
at Labyrinth.
So you should just be running out to go get them after
Right.
the talk. So we have a lot to cover, and obviously there's an election here this week that we should touch on the implications of that. But I did want to start a little bit more with your own story and the story of your family. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own life. You're the other main character in this story, and there's a parallel between your path and the path of your father. Your father going to Beijing in 1950 with a degree of hope, you traveling to Beijing as a New York Times correspondent in 2008,
Right.
which was also a moment of real hope for China. This was the Beijing Olympics. This was sort of, in some sense, the highest expectations in terms of the CCP, a lot of optimism, I think, in Chinese society at that time. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal decision to go to China and your emotions at that early phase in your New York Times posting in Beijing?
Yeah, I had, from the early days when I was practicing journalism, and even in grad school at Berkeley, after I did my first newspaper job, one of my goals was to eventually work in China as a foreign correspondent because I was studying international relations, Chinese history at Berkeley. I was obviously I'd started studying Chinese in Beijing before going grad school. And so but then my career took a big detour in my early years at the New York Times, because when I was working there in New York, the 9/11 happened. America invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. And then I spent 3.5 years working in Iraq, covering the war starting from 2003. And partly my expectations and my framing of China, and also my eagerness to go work there outside of my earlier goals, was because of my reaction to what I'd seen in Iraq, what I experienced on a day-to-day basis when I was there. And I had become very skeptical of American foreign policy by the time I left Iraq. I'd seen the catastrophe that America had brought to this country in the middle of the Middle East for different reasons. I think the Bush administration, all the principals had different reasons for waging this war, but in the end, around an estimated 300,000 Iraqi civilians died because of this war. And so I thought that here you have this other superpower in the world, clearly the rising alternative to the US. And I was very curious to see what the country was like, and also whether there would be some alternative model that they were offering the world or would offer the world. And so I went there with those expectations, and my expectations dovetailed, as you point out, with, I think, global expectations of where China might be going, because 2008 was this watershed year where China was getting the Olympics, so it was kind of this coming out year for China. But in the fall of that year, the economic crisis that started in American banking institutions began unfolding, and China started their own stimulus policies to ride that out. But I think within China, and especially within the party, there was this feeling of triumphalism over the American system, because America was mired in this war in the Middle East, and it had also its system had created this global financial crisis. And so I think that there was this moment of triumphalism at that time in China, and I began documenting China from that period onward into the Xi Jinping era.
Well, and it's also, when we look back, that was a period, that kind of who-when period was a period of relative openness in Chinese society. And maybe we didn't realize it at the time, but in some sense that was the golden era of foreigners going to China to find jobs or to do research or to work in papers. I forget what year that image is from of you all at the New York Times, but there's some familiar faces in that photo, and it's the size of the bureau at that time in Beijing was quite striking. And so tell us a little bit about reporting on China during that period of time. How was it? How was life as a
I mean, what you say is absolutely true, that the number of foreign correspondents or international journalists who were based out of Beijing or elsewhere in China was enormous. I mean, compared to what it is now. That picture that you mentioned was taken in 2015, probably at the height of the Bureau when I was the bureau chief there. We had around 8 to 10 Americans or other nationals with full-time resident visas working in China. We had an equal number of Chinese staff. And so we could all report on different aspects of the country. I think the coverage of China was much more wide-ranging back then than it is now. We, for example, we even had a reporter whose like main focus was culture, and it feels like a luxury today to be able to have such a large staff. And so I felt our coverage of China was wide-ranging. You probably experienced this, Rory, when you were there, that travel within the country is very easy. I mean, I could pick up at any point and go report on anything. There was only one area that was explicitly off limits to us unless we were with a government minder, and that's Tibet, central Tibet. I could even go to Tibetan regions that were outside of central Tibet and report on there fairly unhindered. When I went out to Xinjiang, I went to Xinjiang many times, partly because I wanted to trace my father's footsteps and partly because I was interested in the issues that were unfolding out there. Sometimes the police would follow me, but other times I could move around, speak with people, and not be bothered or harassed by the police. So the experiences out in those Western regions, the most sensitive areas of China, really varied more widely. And by the time I left in 2016, the security apparatus had tightened up a lot in those areas. They were on the lookout. The police were much more wary of foreign journalists coming out there. My last trip in China before I moved out, before I settled for good here in Princeton for that year, was to Kashgar, which is out in far western Xinjiang, and the police followed me every step of the way when I was in there for the couple nights I was out there. And in retrospect, I know now, and some of the things I saw out there now were the start of the hardline Chinese policies to really try and forcefully, in their view, forcefully assimilate the Uyghur Muslims and Kazakh Muslims into what they saw as mainstream Han culture, and to really suppress expressions of cultural individualism out there. And so that was the security clampdown was one of the last things I saw.
One of the themes of your father's story is this sort of transition from optimism and hope, experiencing repression and famine in his instance firsthand, and then a period of disillusionment.
Mhm.
Did you undergo a similar transition yourself in terms of going to China in 2008 when things were a little easier, and then being in a leadership position at a time when foreign journalism came under attack, when civil society came under attack, when kind of repression elevated in Chinese society? Did you talk in your book about how by 2016 things had gotten just a lot more difficult from a day to day? Did you feel that
Right.
disillusionment of the same transition?
Yeah, I did feel that sense of change, and it did weigh on me because obviously it had a direct impact on our work and also on, for example, the Chinese reporters who were working with us. So for example, in the later years of my time there, because of the increasing security clampdown that was taking place across large parts of civil society in China, the Chinese staff were placed at greater risk because the police would call them more often to interview them about what we were doing. Essentially, the police would try and recruit them as spies within our bureau to report on what we were doing. Of course, the reporters that I know never really caved into those pressures, but you could feel the pressures building. You could also feel the pressure building on just sources we spoke with. Like when I went on, for example, a reporting trip out to Gansu province up to this mountain range there to speak with a Chinese scientist who's working on climate change issues. And we talked about how glaciers in the range are receding. Very innocuous subject, something that's in line with the central policy drive from Beijing to address climate change. But shortly after the article was published, I got a call from the scientist and learned that the police had contacted him simply because I'd gone out there and interviewed him. And it became very clear to me that many, many parts of Chinese civil society were being placed under great pressure by the new authoritarian direction of Xi Jinping, and that the era of a move towards greater liberalization, at least economically in civil society, was ending. And I think we can say that definitively now, looking back.
One of the other themes of your book that I wanted to touch on is memory. And I look at your book as a project of memory, of documenting memories. And in our field, in the study of Chinese politics, we often write about how memory transmission works in an authoritarian system when people have experienced trauma. And often, the general point of view is that Chinese citizens often sort of bury that trauma. Memories aren't necessarily transmitted to the next generation. Louisa Lim has her book, The People's Republic of Amnesia. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, your father went through so much and you actively sought out his memories and to try to document them. Was he also telling you some of these stories when you were younger, before you kind of came into your own political consciousness? Like, how was memory in the Wong household?
Yeah. He never told me any of these stories when I was growing up. And I didn't probe either because I wasn't that interested in it personally, but these weren't things that he shared. And it's kind of interesting because, for example, when I talk with, friends from whose parents come from certain other cultures here, for example, Jewish American friends, obviously the passing on of the memories of the Holocaust is very important to them, I think. Whereas for a lot of Chinese Americans who grow up in the US, like they're the generation that migrated here from communist Mao era China, those parents often don't want to talk about that period. And but I did seek my father out in my 20s to start excavating those. And actually, what I found to my surprise was that he didn't have a lot of reluctance once I sought him out in terms of telling me those stories and those memories. He was fine telling me about his time in the PLA, about his attempts to embrace the party and embrace Mao, and about the disillusionment. And then I went back to him again in 2018 when I started writing the book in earnest and really probed deeper. And again, he was very forthcoming with those memories. One thing I think that's interesting, and you must have run into this in some of your research projects, Rory. I know historians often run into this. He told me his memories, of course, they're decades old. Part of the question in my mind is how accurate are the memories to what actually took place? I found a series of letters that he wrote in the late 50s and early 60s to his older brother, Sam. And when I compare those to what he told me decades later, actually they match up very well, incredibly well. I was very surprised by that. But there is a moment, I think this is one of those things where he might have suppressed or whitewashed an important memory. In one of the letters, he describes his first arrival in Xinjiang with the army units. And he says, oh, this is an, far-flung part of China. It doesn't even feel like I'm in China anymore. There's around 15 different ethnic groups out here. They each have their own culture, their own language, their own perspective on things. One thing that unites all of them is they all seem to have an intense hatred of the Han people. The Han people are people like my father who are from interior China. And my father, in my interviews with him, never talked about that tension that he first encountered when he got out there. And but in the letter, he explicitly mentions it, and then he attributes it to the failed policies of the nationalist commanders who had been out there before the communists and the warlords who have been out there, all ethnic Han people who have been out there before the communists. So obviously, there's already a built-in tension, I think, between these Han military leaders who are out there in their form of conquest, and then the indigenous population that's out there. And he sort of doesn't remember that as he tells me the story, but it's there in the letters.
Well, it brings me to another theme of your book, and it's in the title, which is the theme of empire. And often we don't always conceptualize the Chinese state as one of empire. But obviously, it's clear that the Chinese government today is struggling to govern places that don't quite want to be governed by Beijing, that don't necessarily consider themselves fully part of China. And obviously, Xinjiang comes to mind. You've also spent time in Hong Kong as well, and we'll hopefully talk about Taiwan later.
Tibet as well.
Tibet, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about Xinjiang more recently? It's a storyline that was very prominent years ago now. For those of you who are less familiar, we know that hundreds of thousands of members of the Uyghur ethnic minority have been forcefully detained and subjected to re-education. We've seen Xi Jinping take this sort of heavy-handed repressive approach with different groups in Chinese society. Given your father's history and your own perspective and experience in the region, how do you think this will play out? Will that approach work? Will forced assimilation work in the longer run, or will it just create more problems?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's another father-son pair in my book that's featured very prominently, and that's Xi Jinping, who's Xi's father, and Xi Jinping, of course. And what's interesting is when my father was out there in Xinjiang, he was working under ultimately the orders of Xi Jinping, because the elder Xi was a compatriot of Mao's, a very trusted ally of Mao's. And when the PLA conquered these parts of the West, he placed Xi Jinping in charge of policy and politics in the area, overseeing even those senior military commanders who were out there. And the elder Xi and Mao had these conversations and debates about, whether to go hardline on the areas or to go softer on the areas. And so the policies would vary by year to year because they would try out different things. And there were times when the communists would seize land from, say, religious institutions, mosques and imams, or Buddhist centers in the West, and then take them. And other times when they would leave those institutions alone, for example. And so there was this debate about exactly how to approach these areas, which are essentially their efforts to bring large parts of non-Han areas that the Qing had conquered in mainly the 17th to 18th centuries into a communist-ruled modern nation state. The Xi Jinping starting, I think primarily, he took power in 2012, and I think primarily around 2014, he makes the decision that the party has to go very hard on the region of Xinjiang. And I think there's several reasons for this. One is obviously, as I mentioned before, he's obsessed with the breakup of the Soviet Union. He thinks there's several reasons for this. One is he thinks economic liberalization, I think, led to that breakup. But another is that he believes that the ethnic groups that are in these very, very discrete ethnic regions of these countries, and the Soviet Union had these large areas like Kazakhstan, as we know, they were never fully integrated into the mainstream of the country, even though they were ruled, in a very decisive manner. And so Xi decides he has to forcefully assimilate these different populations in Xinjiang. And it also dovetails with around the time when there's several violent episodes in the region, plus there's the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And I heard Chinese officials out there saying, but we could have an ISIS on our hands in Xinjiang if we don't do something about it now. And so even though, you know, there was no sign that there was any radical group that was about to arise from the Muslim population out there. And from my experience, having spent time out there, there was no, you know, they practice a very moderate form of Islam, and it's very different than what you might then, for example, the Salafist form that you might see in parts of the Middle East. And so they, but Xi decides that he has to take this hardline approach. He brings in a party secretary who had been governing Tibet, puts him in charge of Xinjiang, and then they start, within a couple of years, they start the internment camp system where they put large numbers of Uyghur Muslims and Kazakh Muslims into these detention centers and try and indoctrinate them, again, in a very hardline manner with party ideology and try and forcefully get there and tamp down their practices of Islam. I mean, I don't see any evidence that might create more stability in the future, or that would, you know, change any aspirations to autonomy or independence that these groups might have. Because as we know, when the Soviet Union did eventually break up, then there was a resurgence, I think, in the cultural and ethnic identities of people in these different regions of the Soviet Union.
Well, and part of the issue in terms of our own understanding of Xinjiang right now is a lot of the work that was being done to uncover what happened, a lot of the investigative journalism that was happening, that those folks were kicked out of China shortly thereafter, folks like Josh Chin. And so there isn't a lot of on-the-ground journalism happening in Xinjiang at the moment. So we're a little bit in the blind there.
Yeah.
I want to be sensitive to time, and we have a great audience today, and I want to be able to open up to questions. So I will limit myself to just a couple more questions. You have shifted and become really involved in covering diplomacy, and you've had the privilege and well-deserved privilege, I should say, of being in the room for really key meetings with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And so can you tell us a little bit, there was one meeting that you covered, which was Blinken's meeting in Beijing with Xi Jinping just after the balloon incident, prior to the big summit between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in San Francisco. This was a particularly tense moment in the relationship. And can you tell us a little bit about what you learned as an observer in that moment, and in general, kind of how the Biden administration approached the China relationship?
Mm-hmm. So this was the episode you're describing, Rory, took place in June of 2023. The spy balloon episode, I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, took place early in 2023, and Blinken actually canceled his very first trip to China as secretary because of the spy balloon episode. And so when we went to China that June, I mean, there were a dozen reporters on the plane with Blinken. It was his very first trip to China, and the first time that Secretary of State had visited in 5 years. But at that time, U.S. officials were telling me the relationship was at its most precarious point in decades. And I remember one official saying that when they were going China, they felt it could go in any direction, even potentially armed conflict, because things had become so tense over a spy balloon episode. So Blinken's trip was an effort to stabilize the relationship and lay the groundwork for a series of meetings over the summer in which U.S. cabinet officials would go to China and talk about the various issues, like Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, talk about financial and economic issues. And Kerry went there and talked about climate change issues. And that eventually led to a Biden-Xi meeting in the fall of that year that's in San Francisco that really stabilized the relationship. But Biden's the Biden administration's general approach to China has been the framework is definitely one of competition. There's no doubt about that. China is a rival and possibly a future adversary. And so what we need to do is we need to first compete economically with them, and then limit their military buildup and their military technologies. And so one of the key things that the Biden administration did was to impose these export controls on advanced semiconductor chips, and try and get other countries like Japan and the Netherlands to limit exports of tools to China that would help them make advanced semiconductors. So part of the Biden administration's drive is to hobble that aspect of China's development, which of course Chinese leaders are irate about. And another aspect is to build up military alliances in the Asia-Pacific region, reinforcing their alliance with Japan, with the Philippines. They're getting more access to military bases near Taiwan that are on Philippine islands, building up this new multilateral partnership between Britain, Australia, and the US, where Australia will get Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the US and eventually build them themselves. And so that's all part of reinforcing a web of alliances in the Asia-Pacific region in order to counterbalance China's military buildup and, in their eyes, to deter China from, for example, potential invasion of Taiwan.
So this brings us to President-elect Donald Trump. We've managed to go 50 minutes without mentioning him, but here we are. So we've sort of seen the Trump-Xi Jinping relationship before, and President Trump has said, you know, they have a close relationship. Obviously, things during the first Trump administration did get very fraught and tense with China. So looking forward, what can we expect with U.S.-China relations under a second Trump administration?
Yeah, I think Trump is a very transparent figure. It's very obvious what policies he wants to adopt on many different issues. And China is one of those. He's talked repeatedly about imposing tariffs of up to 60% on Chinese goods imported into the U.S., which would, of course, could cause economic shockwaves here in the U.S., given how integrated trade is between China and the U.S. and how large they are as trade partners. But he wants to do that because he has this vision of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., which of course is very difficult. I think any economist will tell you that's very difficult to do, especially the type of manufacturing that China is doing. But that's his goal. I think that he's always been obsessed with the trade element and the manufacturing element of the relationship between these two countries. That, in his mind, is core to it. I think in the first Trump administration, which I covered, there were advisors around him who were much more focused on, for example, the military aspect of the relationship. And so they were intent on trying to build up the US military presence in the Asia Pacific. Now there are certain people who might go into the new Trump administration. I think Bridge Kobe, who was worked under Defense Secretary Mattis in the first administration, is one potential candidate who could have a senior national security position in the next administration. He spoke here, I think, a few weeks ago, Rory.
Yep.
And I think he's been pretty clear about laying out his vision for competition with China, which is build up the American military in the Asia-Pacific region, go on a very rapid buildup, because he thinks that that is what's necessary to deter any ideas that China, that Xi or his aides might have of invading Taiwan. So his main policy position is pour lots of resources to building up the US military. I think he also believes, though, in another aspect of policy over Taiwan, which is assurance, and that the US has to engage in diplomatic conversations with China and assure the leadership in Beijing that the US does not support independence in Taiwan, because that is also a potential catalyst for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So, so his primary goal is to build up the US military. Of course, some critics think that that could actually provoke China into aggressive moves in the Asia Pacific, because they might think what the US is doing is trying to keep Taiwan permanently out of reach of the PRC. I think in the heads of Xi Jinping and others, there always has to be the possibility that Taiwan can be brought under communist rule, whether it's through diplomacy and negotiations or if that doesn't work, through military action. And if the U.S. has an intent of either permanently keeping Taiwan out of the reach or supporting independence for Taiwan, then that could lay the foundation for maybe aggressive military action on the part of the PLA towards Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, what I see, it just seems like it's such a high variance outcome. We don't quite know what a Trump-China policy looks like moving forward, and it could be a function of his advising team. And you could imagine a scenario where there is sort of steadfast support for Taiwan. You could also envision a scenario where he sort of abandons Taiwan to make some sort of deal with Xi Jinping. He's had comments in the past couple years about Taiwan we get nothing from Taiwan. He doesn't seem to have a heartfelt commitment to Taiwan.
Right.
He sort of views it as a peace negotiating chip more than anything.
Yeah,
So it's hard to gauge what the future will hold.
Yeah, and I think that we should take him at his word when he said that. That's an authentic expression of his views on Taiwan. That he said not even just years ago, it's like very recently, I think within the last couple months on the campaign trail, he said that, oh, Taiwan is our partner, but they're not paying us a lot of money for our protection. Why are we letting them get away with that? Like he said that in very blunt terms, just as he said that about other partners and allies. And he's also said, oh, Xi Jinping is a brilliant man and he's a good friend. So I think I could definitely, as you lay out, Rory, see a scenario where Taiwan becomes a bargaining chip for him for other things that he wants to do, especially on trade.
Yeah. So I've monopolized the conversation. I'm so sorry. Ed also has a ton of experience covering other parts of the world and has written about Ukraine, has written about the Middle East. And so we don't need to limit the conversation to China. And in fact, I hope we move into other areas. So let's open it up for questions now. If you raise your hand, I will try to find students first if I can see you. And just introduce yourself and please limit your questions to one question. And questions have a question mark, always. Anybody want to start? All right, you're not a student. Oh, you're not a student, so we're going to start up here, yeah. But we'll get to you next.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tobin Nelson. I'm an MPP student here on sabbatical of sorts from the U.S. Department of State. Thanks for this. This was really great. As I look at the U.S. China relationship, I see a lot of ways in which our values and our national strategic objectives are really incompatible. I think about document number 9 from the CCP and our national security directives. Are we in a situation by which we are, in essence, destined for long-term strategic competition? Or are there, in fact, paths where we can put a lot of the rhetoric and rivalry beyond us and find a more fruitful relationship?
That's a good question. I think from what I can tell right now, from the point of view of policymakers in Washington, which you obviously know that environment well as those in Beijing, that both sides have accepted and embraced this idea that there is long-term competition. I don't see either side trying to move the relationship back to what it was in the 1990s to 2000s, especially after China entered the WTO, of this hyper engagement based mainly on commercial interests. And that at that time, I think US officials, and I heard an Obama administration official even tell me this, that they felt that economic liberalization of China would at least lead to some form of political change within China, maybe not the crumbling of the CCP, but would make them at least adopt softer political lines. And that just hasn't happened. And I haven't heard anyone in the American policymaking apparatus argue that that could still be a path forward. So I think that there is both sides are set on this idea of long-term competition. I think it's ideological on both sides. Like, I think that, the ideological aspects of the relationship are front and center now. The US, which is still at this point a democracy, and views the export of democratic principles as an important part of its foreign policy is in direct clash with an entrenchment by Xi Jinping and authoritarian nature of the state. And I don't think, I mean, the U.S. can work with authoritarian partners. It has plenty of allies and partners like that. Saudi Arabia is a good example. It's moving towards a warmer relationship with Saudi Arabia, whether it's Biden or Trump. I think they'll get closer. But with China, because of the national power that China has and its presence on the world stage, the U.S. Will always, or at least not always, but will at the current moment see a country like that with an authoritarian government like that as one that it has to adopt a semi-hostile, semi-competitive relationship with. And on China's part, they also suspect, because of U.S. efforts to export democratic principles, they suspect that the U.S. will want to topple the party if the U.S. sees a chance to do that. I do think leaders in Beijing think that.
Marty?
I'm Martin Flaherty. I teach human rights in China. Oh, sorry. Martin Flaherty. I teach China and human rights as well as Chinese foreign policy.
Yeah, I've read some of your writings, Martin.
Oh, very good. Okay. So, and I've assigned some of yours. So my question is, what lessons do you think that she is drawing from the experience of Russia in Ukraine? And related to that, how do you think the kind of three-way bromance between Putin, Xi, and Trump is going to affect Ukraine, Taiwan, and U.S. foreign policy more generally?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard U.S. officials, and I think like Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, has said this maybe in congressional testimony, or Avril Haines has said this, that, you know, Chinese officials have looked at what's going on in Ukraine, and it has made them more wary of trying military invasion of Taiwan. They haven't presented the intelligence or the evidence for that, but they say we believe we have intelligence that shows this. I think that's the only thing we have to go on at this point. I don't have any insight into the discussions over the Ukraine war that have taken place in China, and I don't think we've seen a lot of external signs of really how they're viewing that war. I do think that I have heard some things on the margins about how she thinks that Putin kind of messed up by not being able to bring the war to a decisive victory early on. I think when she put his backing diplomatically behind Putin for this after the war started, that he thought that this would be a much shorter episode, but instead it's been disruptive across the world and has created a lot more tension, I think, in U.S. China relations, as well as China's relations with certain other countries and with Europe in particular, that she doesn't like. And so I don't know how they view the prospect of a military invasion of Taiwan. I think it's a black box. We don't know at what point they feel their military power might be capable of pulling off something like that. We don't know if they're willing to pay the cost for something like that. And so I think that Ukraine does add to this idea. I think that's very prevalent if you're sitting in Beijing, you're looking around at how superpowers have fought wars recently. It includes not just Ukraine, but of course the US and Iraq and Afghanistan, that a superpower can think that it can easily bring an invasion to a close and a decisive victory, but instead it becomes this bloody, protracted affair. And I think that could be giving them pause. I don't know that. They're obviously continuing military buildup. People like Kobe, whom I mentioned earlier, say, oh, we should look at that as a sign that they're intent on invading Taiwan. Like that's how we can glean intentions from this capability that they're building up. But I'm not, I don't know. I think the verdict's out on that. And your question on the bromance, that's a very good question. I mean, Trump obviously has expressed open admiration for Putin, for Xi, and as well as for Kim Jong-un. Like Kim Jong-un, I think Kim and Trump actually had the closest bromance of any two world leaders that Trump was dealing with. Trump loves those letters they wrote back and forth. He took them to Mar-a-Lago. They were among the classified documents that he brought to Mar-a-Lago, if I'm not mistaken. And the fact that he sees himself as part of this autocrat boys club, I think raises big question marks about, what what U.S. policy might be towards Russia, towards China, and towards North Korea as well. I don't know where that, how that'll play out. I think that's one of the biggest questions around his foreign policy going forward.
So let's get a few more questions. And I have a question here, and then others, you can just make eye contact with me if you have one.
Since 2020, when most foreign journalists were ejected out of China, what have been the most critical gaps in our coverage of the country? Or are we at a point where we don't even know what's missing? Like there are unknown unknowns.
I think one thing that's very obvious that we're missing is we're missing a lot of stories just on the texture of life in China and social trends in China. It's because of the limited number of journalists. For example, I know at the New York Times, we only have 2 full-time journalists right now in China. Then they have to spend time reporting the politics and the economic trends of China, but you miss a lot about the social trends that are going on across the country. When we had more journalists, obviously everyone had different beats, and there were people who would cover those, even as I said, culture, for example. So I think that we're clearly missing that element about China. I think also with less journalists, you just have less eyes and ears on the ground, making contacts who might give you some insight into the biggest black box in China, which is elite politics. Like I remember when the Bois scandal broke out in 2012, like we had multiple reporters in our bureau contacting different sources in different parts of the system to try and glean what was going on. And I think we got some, the Wall Street Journal, the Times, other papers did get some pretty solid hints about what was going on. I think that would be very difficult today, just because the sheer drop in numbers of journalists, plus the tightening around information on the party elite that Xi Jinping has put in place.
Others. Hansen?
Hi, that was an amazing talk. I'm a graduate student in chemical engineering. I was wondering, in your experience covering how U.S. policymakers negotiate with their Chinese counterparts, is there a special guiding philosophy or unique approach that they take? I guess my motivation for asking this is this could be dated, but Kissinger would remark how back in the 70s, when dealing with Chinese officials, you couldn't deal with issues on a case-by-case basis. Things were linked. You sort of have to go about it in a more like grander philosophical way. They were more interested in seeing where U.S.-China relations would be, generally speaking, years into the future, as opposed to dealing with like particular topics.
Yeah. I think that's generally, I think that both officials on both sides do think about, the trajectory of the relationship, which goes back to the earlier question about, is it about competition or is it about cooperation? Like, what's the balance of that? I think both sides think about that bigger picture question when they're interacting on individual issues. But from what I can tell from my coverage, Chinese and US officials will interact on very discrete issues. For example, there will be American officials who are supposed to deal with Chinese on climate change issues, and they will speak with their Chinese counterparts specifically just on those issues when they're in a venue, whether it's in Beijing or Washington or some international forum, for example. There's signals from above, like the leadership in both countries have said, climate change, they've explicitly said climate change is an area where we can cooperate, even though we're operating this framework of competition. So that empowers these mid and lower level officials to have dialogues about that. Whether they're fruitful dialogues, I think, is an open question, but they do negotiate and discuss those topics outside of having to worry about, the big picture ideas that animate the relationship. And that ranges, like, recently the Biden administration said, we've seen China offer more cooperation on trying to clamp down on the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals to the US and to Mexico. And so I think that there are these very specific issues that the two sides can speak about and they don't have to take into account the big picture. But the direction is set by the leadership, and they're permitted to talk about these things because the leadership says these are issues you should negotiate on.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yep.
I was hoping you could comment on the dynamics of the Thucydides trap and how this argument of the Thucydides trap and how it may be influencing the U.S. and Chinese foreign policy. The Thucydides trap was proposed a few years ago by Graham Allison. I think how the past 500 years, if we look at 16 moments of transition of one rising power with one established power, it is in the interest of the established power, superpower, to provoke a war before the rising power becomes even more powerful. And how would this dynamic, what does this dynamic say about a potential conflict? Would it only be in the interest of the US to provoke a war earlier on, or would it in any way serve Chinese interest to have an international conflict in this moment that some may argue there is a transition? And how does India fit into that? Because I think a few years back, like 3 years ago, the US ambassador to NATO had invited India, for example, to have a closer relationship with NATO. So I'm wondering, is the US trying to form alliances in the Southeast Sea and even try to bring India closer to NATO in an interest of provoking the dynamics of the Thucydides trap before China become even more powerful?
Right. I mean, the idea that you mentioned about the relative national and military powers of these two rivals and whether, the more dominant power might want to engage in a war with the others while they have the advantage is something that I've heard on the margins, but not in mainstream policy thinking, whether in the Trump administration or the Biden administration. And even now when I talk with people who might end up, in senior positions in the Trump administration, they mention deterrence and not like actually fighting a war, because I think they say that our preferred scenario is not to have to fight with China because it would just be devastating for the world economy. I think everyone knows that there would be lots of, besides lives being lost, there'd be lots of damage to, to U.S. trade, to its economy, these other things. And so, also, I think some years ago, when this book, The Thucydides Trap, came out, which we're already very familiar with, there was a lot more questions asked about, is war inevitable? I think now that's less of a question of forefront. It's more about how you establish deterrence, so that and Graham Allison, the author of that book, also argues that war is not inevitable. So you would only want to fight a war, I think, as the dominant military power now if you think it's inevitable. If people don't think it's inevitable, then deterrence is the thing that they want to try and build up. In terms of India, I mean, the US has this thing that it's been reinforcing called the Quad, which is India, Japan, Australia, the US. That's not a military partnership. It's more of an economic technology relationship. The US definitely wants to have India think of the US as a potential military partner if there's hostility of China, like it's trying to reinforce that line of thinking. China's actions in the Himalayas helps prod India in that direction. But that's separate. The question you raised about NATO, I haven't gotten any sense from US officials that, from any administration, that they think bringing NATO into some alignment with India is something that's imminent or that they're working on rapidly right now. They do want to bring NATO closer into Asia. There's this talk of possibly NATO opening an office in Japan, for example. But they also have said, one senior official has said to me that they don't see Asian nations being part of NATO. Like they're not trying to build a mutual defense organization that spans the Atlantic and the Pacific, but they do want the Europeans more involved in Asian security issues, because they think that helps deter China from invading Taiwan or taking more aggressive actions. one thing that, one side note on this is that these North Korean troops being deployed to Russia to fight Ukrainians actually works against China's interests because China doesn't want Europe involved in East Asian security issues. So, but what Russia is doing is it's bringing Asia into European security issues. And that, I think that there's potential for China. I don't know this for a fact. There's potential for Beijing to be concerned about that because it gets Europe much more animated about what North Korea, China, Russia are all doing together.
Okay, well, I think we're at time. So thank you all for the questions. Please join me in thanking Ed Wong.
Thanks. Thanks, Lori. That was good.